The scream shattered the silence before sunrise. An old man collapsed on the stone floor of his kitchen, his hand still clutching a sealed letter, addressed in trembling ink to two children who hadn't spoken to him in 19 years. The letter dropped beside him unopened, as his eyes froze on the ceiling fan that spun uselessly overhead. His name was Elias Macris, once a philosophy teacher, now a forgotten relic in a rented Greek village home, estranged from everything he once believed he'd built. That morning, the neighbors found him. Not the children. Not the wife who'd buried her love under years of silence. Just strangers, and a dog that refused to leave his side. In the letter, never read, were 9 lines, one for every year he hadn't seen his daughter, and one final line for the son who never forgave. The ink was smudged, like it had been rewritten 100 times. Nobody knew what it said. But those who saw his eyes before the end said they weren't begging. They were whispering something lost. A truth that died before it could be passed on. Elias had not been a good man, but he had once tried. There were nights when he burned letters instead of mailing them, afraid they'd reveal too much. Other nights he drank himself silent, whispering philosophical riddles to walls that couldn't argue back. Once, he believed in truth. Capital T, truth. The kind Socrates died for. But truth, he learned, does not raise children. It does not pay hospital bills or mend a young girl's heart when her father forgets her school play. He taught virtue in lecture halls, but couldn't model it in his home. His son Nikos walked out the night Elias called love a weakness. His daughter Eleni stopped writing after he forgot her birthday 3 years in a row. What killed Elias wasn't just age, it was the weight of memory pressing against a heart that never learned how to say sorry. He had hoped the letter would speak what his tongue never could. But some words, when delayed too long, collapse under their own regret. In his final weeks, Elias had scribbled quotes from lost Greek philosophers in the margins of newspapers and receipts. Not Plato or Aristotle, the ones who got buried. Ones whose ideas never made it past war or translation. The soul bends like a reed when denied forgiveness, he wrote on a bakery napkin. He believed wisdom had been erased, not disproven. And maybe, if his children read these thoughts, they'd find pieces of the father he never knew how to be. He wasn't trying to be remembered, he was trying to be understood. There's a difference. He feared his legacy would be silence. Not scandal. Not drama. Just forgotten thoughts, and a name that sounded too heavy in someone else's mouth. So he left symbols behind, a stack of marked-up books in the attic, a drawer filled with unsent birthday cards, and one final envelope with no stamp. Only names and tears that had dried long ago. Eleni stood outside the village post office, staring at a return envelope marked undeliverable. Her father's address had changed without warning again. She clenched it tightly, remembering the last voicemail he left. 5 seconds of silence and a breath, then nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just stared at the ground like it owed her an explanation. Nikos, her brother, told her years ago to stop reaching out. He made his choice, he had said. But daughters don't sever so cleanly. They fray. They ache. They fold the pain into little corners of their life and pretend it doesn't shape them. Eleni looked up at the sky, gray, unmoving, and thought about the time her father taught her constellations and told her she was made of stars. She didn't remember the stars. Just that he stopped saying it. She didn't know then that as she walked home that morning, he lay still in a house not too far from where she stood. Nikos hadn't spoken his father's name aloud in over a decade. Not out of hatred, but out of erasure. To say the name was to invite memory, and memory had teeth. He lived far away, physically, emotionally, philosophically. Where Elias saw virtue, Nikos saw abandonment painted in eloquent excuses. He remembered watching his mother cry behind closed doors while Elias wrote lectures about emotional restraint. He remembered the silence at the dinner table, louder than any fight could have been. And he remembered the last thing he ever said to his father, "You taught ethics, but you never learned love." That line stuck to his ribs like a curse. He sometimes wondered if it broke Elias. But then, he shook the thought. It wasn't his job to heal the man who broke him. That's what he believed, until the phone rang that morning. Until the neighbor's voice said, "Your father's gone, and he left something for you." Eleni sat on the edge of her childhood bed, the same room her father painted blue when she was 5, now cracked and faded. She hadn't been back in years. The village felt smaller, quieter, like even time had abandoned it. On the nightstand was a box left by the neighbors, marked with her name in Elias' handwriting. Inside, she found old cassette tapes labeled by month and year. She stared at one marked August, Eleni's 10th birthday. The recorder was already in the box. She pressed play. Static. Kind. Then his voice, younger, softer, nervous. "To my little philosopher. If you're ever listening to this, it means I wasn't brave enough in life." Her throat tightened. He spoke of the stars, of regret, of missing her first recital. He said her voice haunted him in dreams. She stopped the tape before it finished. Not out of anger. Out of fear. Fear of feeling too much too fast. Nikos didn't attend the funeral. He couldn't. But he did show up 3 days later, not for closure, but out of duty. He walked into his father's study, untouched, and stared at the rows of books, marked with notes in the margins. "Virtue is nothing without presence," one read. Another, "I taught strangers. I abandoned blood." Nikos scoffed at first. Philosophy, even now. But beneath the desk, he found a locked drawer. He broke it open. Inside was a folder with his name. Not lectures. Not theories. Letters. Dozens of them never sent. Written after every major moment in Nikos' life. His graduation, his first published essay, even his marriage. Elias had watched from afar. Loved from afar. Nikos felt fury. Then grief. Then something stranger. Recognition. A father too scared to return, too proud to beg. It didn't excuse it. But it explained something. Sometimes pain hides in silence, not absence. Eleni met Nikos outside the house that evening. They hadn't spoken face to face in almost 5 years. No fights. Just space. Protective silence. She held the tape in her hand but didn't mention it. He held a letter but kept it in his coat pocket. The air between them was full of words they hadn't earned the right to speak. "Did he leave you something?" Nikos asked. Eleni nodded. "Yeah." A voice I don't recognize. Nikos looked down. "He wrote me letters. All of them unread." Eleni studied him. "So now what?" she asked. He didn't answer. Because grief doesn't come with instructions. It comes with echoes. They sat on the stone steps, side by side, not touching, not crying. Just two people trying to make sense of a man who taught them logic, but left them hollow. The wind carried a smell of olives and old rain. And for once the silence didn't feel like an enemy. That night, Eleni dreamt of the classroom where her father once taught. Rows of empty desks. A chalkboard still bearing a quote, "Know thyself." She walked through it, like a museum. Relics of a man she knew only from fragments. At the front desk was her father, younger, vibrant, smiling with sad eyes. "You're not real," she whispered. He said nothing. Just reached out a hand, offering her a copy of an old philosophy text. Inside, underlined, was one passage: "To live is to fail repeatedly at love and still return to it unashamed." She woke with tears on her cheeks, unsure if they belonged to her or the child still inside. She whispered to the ceiling, "I don't forgive you. But I hear you now." The room was silent, but something had shifted. It wasn't peace. But it wasn't bitterness either. It was the beginning of an ache she no longer had to carry alone. Nikos stood by the edge of the cliffs behind the village, the same place Elias used to bring them when they were children. He remembered his father once saying, "The sea forgives without needing to be asked." He thought it was poetic nonsense then. Now, it haunted him. He took one of the unsent letters and read it aloud, voice cracking, eyes burning. In it, Elias spoke of pride, of cowardice, of the silent moments he wished he had filled with courage. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He just admitted he didn't deserve it. That was what made it real. Nikos folded the letter, kissed it once, and let the wind take it. It didn't matter if Elias hurt him now. What mattered was letting go. Because sometimes the truest act of love is releasing what never loved you properly, and still wishing it peace. The morning after the dream, Eleni opened the last drawer in Elias's study, the one he always kept locked. Inside was a tattered notebook, the first page titled, "Failures I Never Confessed." Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. Each entry was a memory he never spoke aloud, missing her school play, yelling at her mother, choosing his career over family. He detailed how each moment haunted him, how he rewrote them in his head every night, always giving himself the courage to choose love. But courage in the mind doesn't echo in the home. Eleni didn't know whether to cry or scream. This wasn't redemption. It was a slow unraveling. Her father wasn't cruel. He was weak. And somehow, that hurt worse. She closed the notebook and whispered, "You wanted to be a philosopher. You should have tried being a father first." Her voice didn't crack. But her heart did. Nikos found an old tape recorder buried beneath a box of vinyl records. When he pressed play, he heard static, then a lecture. Not to students. To them. "If you're hearing this, I've already lost the right to speak in person." Elias's voice cracked between words. "I believed my silence protected you, but silence is just fear in formal wear." He went on, confessing how he watched Eleni from afar when she visited the city for school, how he kept tabs on Nikos' publications through academic journals. "I thought if I admired you enough in silence, it counted as love," he said. Nikos clenched his jaw. This wasn't enough. A tape couldn't erase years. But for the first time, he didn't hear a man preaching. He heard a man pleading. Not for forgiveness, but for acknowledgement. And in that moment, Nikos realized something. The hardest truths are the ones whispered too late. Eleni stood in the garden behind the house, overgrown, forgotten, and found the rusted sundial Elias used to teach her about time. She remembered his voice. "We measure daylight, not regrets." Now those words felt hollow. She knelt beside it, pulling weeds with her bare hands, like reclaiming something he let rot. It wasn't about gardening. It was about memory. She found an old trinket buried in the soil, a toy compass she lost as a child. She held it to her chest and sobbed. Not because of what it was, but because he never told her he found it. That was his pattern, letting moments rot quietly instead of breathing life back into them. She sat back in the dirt, covered in earth, and whispered, "I needed you to guide me, but you only watched me wander." And for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the absence as truth, not betrayal. Back in the study, Nikos opened one final envelope addressed simply, "To be opened if you ever return." Inside was a short note. "Son, I taught ethics to generations, but I never learned how to say I was wrong. I loved you clumsily, and I hope someday you'll do better than I did." Attached was a photo, a candid shot of the three of them from when Nikos was a boy, Elias holding him on his shoulders, Eleni gripping his hand. For a second, the memory blinked alive. Laughter. Sandals. Sun, dight, ite. Then, it faded. Nikos placed the photo beside the letter and stared at it. This wasn't closure. But it was something. Maybe fathers don't always finish stories. Maybe sons have to write the final line. He didn't know if he forgave the man in the picture. But he saw him now. Not as a symbol, but as a man. Flawed. Frightened. Human. While that evening, Eleni and Nikos walked through the village streets, side by side, saying little. The houses whispered memories neither wanted to confront. At the small square where Elias once lectured during town gatherings, a candle had been left beside a chair. No note. just a gesture from someone who remembered. Eleni stared at the flame. He thought words would save him, she said. Nikos nodded, but he forgot to speak them when it mattered. They sat in silence, watching the candle flicker. You think we'll become like him? She asked. Nikos hesitated. Only if we confuse thinking with feeling. Eleni laughed. Bitter, soft, tired. It was the first time they had spoken about their father without armor. And that moment, that quiet honesty, did what Elias never managed in life. It connected them. Not through philosophy, but through the ache of trying not to repeat the same mistakes. Eleni returned to the attic one last time. She had avoided it. The smell of dust, the slope of the ceiling, the echoes of childhood she had buried deep. In the far corner was a trunk. Not locked, not hidden, just overlooked. Inside she found dozens of folders marked with university logos, medical papers, receipts. And tucked between them a file marked Adoption Agreement, Confidential. Her hands froze. One. Her breath shortened. She pulled it open. The name wasn't hers. It was Nikos. She read it again. Her father hadn't abandoned his son. He had adopted him. Elias wasn't Nikos' biological father. He was the man who chose him, and never told him. Her eyes blurred with shock. Suddenly, the coldness between them made sense. Elias had tried to love Nikos, but never believed he had the right to. Not fully. And Nikos, unknowingly, resented a man who had tried to become what no one else would. Nikos stared at the document in silence. Eleni hadn't meant to break him. But some truths do that. They don't cut. They collapse. He sat on the porch, letter in hand, his whole childhood reframed in a paragraph. He wasn't my father, he whispered. Eleni sat beside him. No, but he chose to be. Nikos laughed, hollow and bitter. Then why did it always feel like he was waiting for me to leave? Eleni didn't answer. Because maybe Elias had always loved Nikos with guilt, like a man borrowing a son, not raising one. Nikos clenched the paper. You know the irony? I hated him for not being present, and now I find out he never felt entitled to show up. The sunset stretched shadows across the stone steps. Eleni placed her hand on his. He failed us differently, but he still failed. And that was the truth they could finally share, one not written in riddles. That night, Nikos wandered alone into the village chapel, empty and echoing with silence. He stood before the altar, not to pray. He had long abandoned faith, but to confront something older than belief, origin. He lit a candle and stared at its flicker. If he wasn't my father, then who was I to him, he muttered. He tried to summon anger, but found only confusion. All those years of withholding love, thinking it protected him, it had only deepened the distance. And yet, Elias had never left. He had signed the papers, paid for school, tracked his successes, loved in secret like a coward with noble intentions. Nikos leaned his head against the cold stone wall. You didn't fail because you rent my blood, he whispered. You failed because you never believed that didn't matter. He left the candle burning, not for faith, but for a truth finally spoken. Eleni returned to her father's grave under the old olive tree. No headstone yet, just disturbed soil and a wooden marker with his name carved in haste. She knelt, holding the toy compass, now clean. You left us a maze, she whispered. And the path out was silence. She set the compass atop the grave. But I think I understand now. You didn't teach us to forgive. You wanted us to figure it out ourselves. She looked up at the branches swaying gently above her, then added, and maybe that's the lesson, that even lost things still point somewhere. The wind shifted. A leaf drifted down and landed on her shoulder. She smiled, not in joy, but in surrender. Her father wasn't a monster. He was a man who mistook shame for virtue. And though he didn't live long enough to fix it, he left behind enough pieces to rebuild something broken. Later that evening, Nikos sat by the window in Elias's study, surrounded by books he once ignored. He picked up one, not a classic, but one filled with handwritten notes. Margin after margin filled with scribbled reflections. Don't be what I became. Be braver. Regret is memory's tax. Philosophy without love is just ego in disguise. Nikos smiled faintly. You weren't trying to teach us. You were trying to teach yourself. He turned to the final page. A single line written in Elias's shaky handwriting. If this ever reaches you, then I wasn't entirely lost. Nikos closed the book and finally said it out loud. Goodbye, Dad. Not Elias. Not the man who raised me, just Dad. It didn't fix everything, but it gave the pain a name, and that was enough to carry it without breaking. Sometimes, the dead don't need redemption. They just need to be seen whole. Eleni stood before the town's community hall, the same place where Elias once held lectures under candlelight. The building was mostly abandoned now, cobwebs curling along the rafters, dust settling on forgotten chairs. She lit a lantern and placed it on the podium, then laid a tape recorder down. One of his. She pressed record. I don't know who this is for, she began, voice shaking. But maybe that's the point. My father left behind more questions than answers. And maybe that's what all parents do. But if anyone finds this, I want them to know. He wasn't heartless. He was scared. He wore silence like a shield. She paused. And I hated him for it, for choosing philosophy over presence, ideas over love. But I'm here now, saying it out loud, so maybe it ends with me. She clicked the recorder off. One final truth sent into the void, hoping someone, someday, would understand. Nikos returned to the cliffs at dawn, holding one last letter from Elias. This one was different, shorter, sharper, written without polish. I failed you. Not because I wasn't your father, but because I never stopped thinking you'd walk away if you knew. Nikos read it again. Then again. Every sentence scraped something raw inside him. And yet, for the first time, he didn't feel like a child abandoned. He felt like a man standing over the grave of someone who tried. Clumsily, quietly, desperately. He held the letter up to the wind. Not to release it, but to face it. He let it slap against his palm like a challenge. You should have told me, he muttered. You should let me choose. His voice cracked. But I get it now. You were just a man trying not to lose another son. He folded the letter and placed it in his coat. Not forgiven, but carried. Eleni and Nikos sat across from each other in the village cafe, empty but for them, and the sound of clinking spoons. Neither touched their coffee. The silence between them wasn't tense anymore. Just tired. Eleni finally spoke. Do you think we'll ever stop being angry? Nikos stared into his cup. No, but maybe we'll stop needing to be. She nodded. Then asked what she had feared for years. Were we enough? Nikos looked at her. For each other. She hesitated. For him. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out one of the tapes. Let's find out, he said. They played it together, sitting close, the voice of Elias crackling between them. I failed often, but I loved always. The tape hissed. Eleni blinked fast. Nikos gripped the edge of the table. In that moment, their pain didn't vanish. But it stood still. And for once, they stood with it. That evening, they returned to Elias's study one last time. Eleni placed the toy compass on the bookshelf. Nikos arranged the letters in a wooden box and sealed it. What do we do with all of this, she asked. Nikos shrugged. We carry it, like he did, but maybe differently. She smiled faintly. With less silence. They locked the door behind them and left the key on the table. No dramatic farewell. No speech. Just the quiet echo of choices made. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering dried olive leaves along the path. As they walked down the hill, The house behind them shrank in the distance, no longer a prison, but a tomb for truths once hidden. Eleni whispered, "Do you think he'd be proud?" Nikos replied, "I think he'd finally feel known." And that, more than pride, was the redemption Elias had never found in life, but maybe, just maybe, found in death. That night, Eleni sat alone on the balcony of the guest house, looking at the stars, the same ones her father once named. She whispered their names aloud. Orion, Cassiopeia, Lyra. Her voice trembled, not with sorrow, but with memory. Behind her, the tape recorder played softly, Elias's voice threading through the silence. "We are stories stitched by silence, hoping someone listens before the last page turns." She smiled through tears. Maybe that's what all of this had been, not closure, but listening. Not rewriting the past, but reading it honestly. She looked up and whispered, "I forgive you. Not because you earned it, but because I can't carry this forever." Then, in the hush of night, she added, "And maybe, you were right. I am made of stars." The wind shifted gently, and in that fragile quiet, it felt like he answered, not in words, but in weight lifted. Weeks later, Eleni stood in front of her classroom, chalk in hand, facing rows of teenage faces who had no idea what she'd lived through. She had returned to teaching quietly, without announcement. But something was different. She didn't start with facts or grammar. Instead, she wrote a single line on the board. "Silence is not always wisdom." The students stared, unsure. "My father taught philosophy," she said, "but never taught me how to forgive." A pause. "This year, we'll learn both." She saw confusion on their faces, but also curiosity. She smiled. "Because learning without feeling is just memorizing, and we don't have time to waste." For the first time in years, Eleni didn't feel like she was performing someone else's version of strength. She was living her own. Not perfectly, but openly. And that, she realized, was more honest than her father had ever dared to be. Nikos began writing again, not essays or critiques, but something else, a book. Its title, "In the Absence of Fathers." He didn't tell anyone at first. Just wrote at night, by the kitchen window, lit by a desk lamp, and guided by memories both sharp and fading. Each chapter was a confession, a reckoning, a reframing of pain. He didn't write to forgive Elias. He wrote to understand himself. On the third night he paused mid-sentence, stared at a blank page and whispered, "You never gave me the words, so I'm giving them to myself." It wasn't closure he wanted. It was authorship. To finally own the story that had shaped him without permission. And in doing so he found something unexpected, peace. Not the kind that forgets, but the kind that lets you rest between sentences, knowing the next line is finally yours to write. Eleni visited their mother's grave for the first time in years. She brought no flowers, just the compass. She knelt in the grass, whispering, "He never knew how to mourn you, so he mourned in silence." Her voice cracked. "But I know now. Mourning isn't weakness, it's honesty." She placed the compass gently beside the headstone. "We didn't become what you hoped, but we're trying." The wind stirred around her, soft and cool. She stood, wiped her face, and looked out, over the hill. In the distance, the village shimmered in midday sun, small and stubborn. She knew now her father wasn't a villain. Just a man with too much fear and not enough time. But in breaking that silence, she had stepped beyond it. Maybe grief was a language, and now, finally, she was fluent. She turned and walked away, lighter, not because the pain was gone, but because it had somewhere to go. Nikos mailed the first 3 chapters of his manuscript to a publisher, not out of ambition, but defiance. He wrote the cover letter plainly. "This isn't about success, it's about voice for the ones raised in silence." He didn't wait for a reply. That wasn't the point. He closed the mailbox, stepped back, and smiled. Not because he expected fame, but because the act itself was an answer to a question Elias never asked aloud. "Will you speak when I couldn't?" Nikos had. And now, others might hear it. As he walked back through the village, he noticed how the streets no longer looked like shadows. They looked like beginnings. Olive trees swayed in the breeze, windows open, shutters swinging. The world hadn't changed. But he had. That was enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was what redemption really meant, not erasing the past, but daring to write past it. That weekend, Eleni and Nikos met at their father's grave, not out of obligation but choice. No words were exchanged for a long time. Then, Eleni placed a book on the soil. The Philosophy of Absence, Elias's unpublished manuscript, found hidden beneath floorboards. Nikos added his own, In the Absence of Fathers. 2 stories, side by side, one unfinished, one just beginning. He tried, Eleni whispered. So did we, Nikos replied. They stood there, not as children of a flawed man, but as survivors of a silence that nearly consumed them. A silence they had broken. Together. As they turned to leave, a breeze passed between them, and the pages of Elias's book rustled softly, like a final exhale. Neither looked back. Not because they didn't care, but because they finally could. And in that small quiet moment, they knew the lesson had landed. The village square was busier now. Children played beneath the olive trees, their laughter drifting past faded walls. Eleni watched from a bench, notebook in hand, jotting words she didn't yet understand. She was no philosopher, but she was learning to listen, to others, to herself, to silence. A student approached, maybe 12, curious. Miss Eleni, did you know your father taught here? She nodded. Yes, he taught many things. The child sat beside her. Was he a good teacher? Eleni thought a moment. He was complicated. The boy tilted his head. That means no. She smiled. It means he tried. And sometimes trying is the lesson. The child didn't fully get it. But that was okay. She wasn't speaking to him, really. She was speaking to her younger self, the girl who once waited for a man who never came. Now she was the one staying. And that, she realized, was enough. Nikos stood before a small audience in a bookstore downtown, holding the first printed copy of his book. He didn't plan a speech. Never liked them. But when the room quieted, he simply said, "This isn't about my father. It's about silence, and what happens when we let it raise us." He let the words settle. We inherit more than blood. We inherit the fears people never name. A woman in the back wiped her eyes. Someone clapped. He smiled faintly. I wrote this because I needed to know that absence doesn't have to be legacy. That we get to choose what we pass down. The event was small. No press. No camera crews. But in that room, something sacred happened. Pain was named, shaped, and released. And in doing so, Nikos didn't just speak for himself. He spoke for every child still haunted by a voice that never arrived. Later that night, Eleni read her father's manuscript for the final time. The last page wasn't finished. It ended mid-sentence. To forgive oneself. No punctuation. No continuation. She stared at it, then closed the book gently. There was something strangely perfect about its incompleteness. Forgiveness, after all, wasn't a conclusion. It was a process. A sentence we rewrite daily. She placed the book beside hers on her desk. Then, without ceremony, she began writing a letter. Not to Elias. To herself. Dear Eleni, you are not the sum of what he didn't say. You are the echo of what he wished he had. Her hands trembled. Her breath steadied. She kept writing. Line after line. Not for healing. Not for publishing. Just to feel what he never allowed himself to feel. Seen. And in that quiet act, she reclaimed her voice from the ghosts of unread pages. Elias's house was empty now. But not hollow. The new family moving in found odd remnants, Greek quotes etched into wood, a compass tucked in a drawer, and a note above the fireplace that read, "If you're reading this, welcome home." They didn't know his story. But the energy of the space felt sacred, like someone had lived here with regret and tried in their final days to do better. Eleni and Nikos never returned to that house again. They didn't need to. The past no longer lived in the walls. It lived in them, not as a weight but as a whisper. Something to remember. Something to learn from. And when they each crossed moments of silence in their own homes, they didn't fill it with noise. They listened. They chose. And in doing so, they gave their children something Elias never could, the sound of love spoken, not withheld. Years later, Eleni sat with her daughter under the stars. The child asked, "Were you always this brave?" Eleni smiled gently. "No, but I learned." The girl leaned on her shoulder. "Who taught you?" Eleni stared at the sky for a moment. "A man who loved me in silence, and a brother who helped me hear him." The girl closed her eyes, soothed by the rhythm of her mother's heartbeat. Above them, the constellations blinked quietly. "What are stars made of?" the child whispered. Eleni paused, then said the line she once heard in a dream. "They're made of all the things we forgive too late." The girl nodded, satisfied. And in that moment, a story ended not with answers, but with inheritance. Not with clarity, but with care. Because some wounds don't close. They become directions. And some echoes don't fade. They become maps.